Welcome back to the QNAMY Show. On today's episode, we're joined by a deeply knowledgeable guest on plant medicine and integration, Dr. Martin Ball. He's a non-dual entheogenic educator and one of the leading voices on 5-MeO-DMT, often known as the God molecule. With a PhD in religious studies and extensive fieldwork among Native American spiritual traditions, Dr. Ball brings a unique scientific and experienced perspective to the world of entheogens. As a pioneer in non-dual energetics, he's authored over 20 books and has been educating the public on 5-MeO-DMT for nearly 2 decades. In this episode, we dive into the profound science and transformative potential of 5-MeO-DMT, exploring the ways it impacts consciousness, healing, and integration. We also touch on his innovative approach to non-dual energetic therapy and share insights into how this powerful molecule can guide individuals towards liberation and self-discovery. If you're curious about the intersection of science, spirituality, and psychedelic healing, this episode is a must listen. So get ready for an enlightening conversation with Dr. Martin Ball as we venture into the world of 5-MeO-DMT and beyond. All right. Martin, welcome to the show. We're so grateful to have you here today to talk more about all of this fun stuff we've got to unpack today. Excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me on. It's going to be a pleasure, I'm sure.
Awesome. Well, just to kind of get us started, you are one of the most well-written, well-publicized individuals that are out there in this particular psychedelic space. And so there's a lot of books that you've got. I think you've mentioned that you've written over 20 books. You've got a podcast that's one of the oldest podcasts in the world for 18 years or something. You've been in production on that. So just amazing to have all of that content online. But I really wanted to dial us back today just to some elementary basics to catch my audience up to what 5-MeO-DMT is and the powerful benefits of it just from a healing modality perspective. So one of my initial questions that I have for you is just if you could walk us through what is 5-MeO-DMT and how is it comparable to other psilocybin or other psychedelic drugs that are not drugs and treatments, plant medicines that are out there?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. And this is kind of the main topic that I've been working on ever since I first experienced 5-MeO-DMT in January of 2008, which was just an absolutely life-transforming experience and really changed the trajectory of how I wanted to focus on psychedelic experience and what I wanted to communicate about it. And so in many respects, everything I've been doing since that January 2008 experience has been informed and has been generated from that. So 5-MeO-DMT. And this is, at this point, this is the molecule that I am best, quote unquote, known for because I've been talking and sharing about it for so long. And back in 2008, it was almost unheard of. Most people had never heard of it, didn't know what it was, didn't know how it compared with other psychedelics. So it's much more commonly known now, but it certainly wasn't at the time. But anyway, let's get into the basics. So 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine is a member of the tryptamine class of psychedelic molecules. This would include things like, obviously, DMT, ayahuasca, which contains DMT, psilocybin mushrooms, and a wide variety of tryptamines that have been discovered and invented in a lab. And we now have potentially hundreds of different kinds of tryptamines. Now, also what's significant is that in the tryptamine class, a tryptamine is a molecule that has a basic chemical structure. And you can put little additions onto this basic chemical structure and you can take things away. And so it's kind of like these little building blocks. Chemists, they play with little balls and they put them together to represent, like, this one's hydrogen, this is oxygen, and all these different elements, and you put them together in these different constructs. But the tryptamine molecule is this basic structure. It's called the indole ring, and you can add and subtract different molecular elements onto that basic ring. So with a tryptamine, from the basic ring, if you make one adjustment, you end up with serotonin, which is a normal human neurotransmitter. And we're using this neurotransmitter all the time. You make another slight addition to it, and it becomes melatonin, which is the neurotransmitter that our bodies release a few hours before bedtime that says, hey, sun's gone down, it's time to transition into going to sleep, putting the ego offline, and getting this restorative rest that we're engaged in. So tryptamine molecules are they're found pretty much everywhere within nature. They're in plants, they're in animals, they're in mushrooms, and they come with all these different variations and varieties. Also within mammals, which include you and me, obviously, we are both mammals. All mammals produce trace amounts of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and also 5-MeO-DMT, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine. So not only is this a substance, or both of these are substances that are found all throughout nature, but they're also found as part of our natural human biochemistry, that they're part of what makes us human beings. Though both DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are generally present in the human body in very, very small trace amounts, so we're not going to be getting a quote-unquote psychedelic effect from them just by being in our bodies. So then 5-MeO-DMT, again, it's part of this tryptamine class of psychedelics, and because it has a structure that's very similar to serotonin, that it interacts with our neurons and our neuroreceptors throughout our brain and throughout our body. We actually have neuroreceptors. They're in our brain, they're in our heart, they're in our lungs, they're in our digestive tract. So that, we tend to think of psychedelics as impacting the brain, but really we have areas where these neurotransmitters are interacting with us physiologically all throughout our body. So there are two main sources of 5-MeO-DMT that are used in, quote, psychedelic sessions or therapies or ceremonies, however we want to characterize them. One is the use of the secretions of the Sonoran desert toad, also known as the Colorado River toad. Formerly was known as Bufo alvarius, that was the scientific name. It recently got renamed to Encilius alvarius, so it actually lost the Bufo designation, which is just Latin for toad.
Oh man, I've been calling it Bufo this whole time.
Well, you see, there's been a lot of publicity around the use of toad secretions over the last decade and a half, roughly speaking. And it's only in the last couple of years that the name got changed to Encilius alvarius. So Bufo, as a word, had already been used as shorthand for these toad secretions. And sometimes it's called toad venom, but if we want to be technical, venom is something that is injected into your body through a bite or a sting. And toads are not biting anyone, that they have these glands on their heads and on their legs and shoulders. And when you squeeze them, this milky, white, gooey, sticky substance comes out. And it's kind of like squeezing the most epic pimple you could ever imagine. And it goes, and this stuff comes out. But then it dries into sort of a crystalline amber-like substance. And that is what is known as toad medicine or Bufo. And within the secretions of the Sonoran desert toad, studies have shown that it can vary from anywhere from 10% 5-MeO-DMT up to perhaps at the highest range 30% 5-MeO-DMT. And this only occurs with the Sonoran desert toad, that most toads produce what is just called bufotoxin, which is 5-HO DMT. It's 5-hydroxydimethyltryptamine, which is another tryptamine, which has a hydroxy group added at the 5 position, versus 5-methoxy-DMT has a methoxy group added at the 5 position, not a hydroxy group. So these small molecular changes make for really, really big differences in terms of how that molecule is processed by the body. So 5-MeO-DMT comes from the secretions of the Sonoran desert toad. It is also found in a wide variety of plants around the world. However, mostly when it shows up in the botanical sphere, that the concentration of 5-MeO-DMT within any given plant is so infinitesimally small that, like, you might have to take a whole tree just to extract a couple milligrams of 5-MeO. So it's not really bioavailable through plants. So the other place that people get 5-MeO-DMT is from molecules that are made in a lab. And one of the terms that I like to use with that form of 5-MeO-DMT is just to call it pure molecule. And that distinguishes it from Bufo or toad secretions, because there are a lot of other tryptamines in the toad secretions. But of course, the reason that people use toad secretions is because it contains 5-MeO-DMT. It's not because it contains any of these other things that are in there. So the most common ways that 5-MeO-DMT is used as a psychedelic is generally through smoking or vaporizing. And this is exclusively true for bufo secretions, that you can only use it by smoking or vaporizing it. You don't want to use any other methodology. But if you're working with a pure molecule of 5-MeO-DMT, depending on whether it's a freebase or a salt or a fumarate, you can also potentially snort it. You can also potentially take it rectally, which some people do, put it in a little capsule and then it goes up there. And 20 minutes later, it's starting to happen. And also sort of a new route that is being developed would be both a nasal spray of like a liquid form of 5-MeO, which would be different than snorting like the crystalline or the powder material. And then also some people are now looking at doing IV injections of 5-MeO-DMT, which tends to slow down the overall experience. Now,
And I just have to ask, for
Sure.
us laymen's out here, what is the reason that you wouldn't be able to ingest it in like a pill form or something like that? You've given kind of every other methodology of consuming it except for consuming it orally. So what is the distinction there?
Well, we have enzymes in our gut that will very rapidly break down both DMT and 5-MeO-DMT if we ingest it. And we can subvert that process by ingesting a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So this is how ayahuasca works. So ayahuasca is always a combination of, at minimum, 2 different plants. One plant contains DMT, dimethyltryptamine. Another plant contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and that allows us to process the DMT through our gut at an experiential level. Now, in theory, you could also do that with 5-MeO-DMT, but 5-MeO-DMT itself is 10 times more potent than DMT. And when combined with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, there we're kind of playing with the possibility of having what is called a serotonin shock syndrome response, where your body overproduces serotonin in response to these molecular transformations that are taking place within your body. And that is an extremely unpleasant experience at the minimum, and at the maximum could potentially cause some kind of tragic death to happen.
Oh, wow.
So when it comes, you can combine DMT with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, but 5-MeO-DMT just overall seems to be too powerful to do something like that it actually becomes medically dangerous. And this is just from the anecdotal reports from people working with these molecules out in the field. This appears to be a much graver danger with bufo than it does the pure molecule of 5-MeO-DMT. And so there have been cases where people have ingested Syrian rue, which contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and then have smoked bufo. They haven't ingested it. But even having a monoamine oxidase inhibitor within your system will tend to amplify the experience that you're having. And then they have smoked bufo, and then they have gone into very distressing serotonin shock syndrome states. So just as a general rule, it's best not to try ingesting it, and certainly not using it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So it's these other routes of administration that are definitely far safer.
And the inhibitor that you're referencing, obviously you're using scientific terms. What are some examples of what those things are? Is that like mixing it with other psychedelics as an example?
The only psychedelic that contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor would be ayahuasca itself, because that's one of the ingredients within the psychedelic. Most other psychedelics are consumed simply on their own. They don't contain a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. However, there are many different kinds of antidepressant medications that contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs. And this is one of the reasons why anyone who wants to work with any of these molecules, they need to go through a medical screening process to assess whether they are taking medications that might be contraindicated by the ingestion of the psychedelic. The psychedelic itself is largely safe, but it's when it potentially combines with these other medications or other molecules, that's when we're getting into health concerns and questions. And so I know that many people these days are turning to psychedelics for treatment of depression and anxiety and PTSD. A lot of those people are already taking a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And so that's where they need to do proper medical screening. And just at the practical level, especially because Bufo has now been included in many retreat menus and programs, that it's very important that if you are going to an ayahuasca retreat and they are also serving Bufo, that ideally the Bufo should be served before drinking ayahuasca, and then there should be a sufficient time period that lapses before drinking the ayahuasca. Or if they're doing Bufo after ayahuasca, that they're again, just to be safe, a minimum of 24 hours really should be in place before going to Bufo, just to avoid any possibility of these contraindications arising and medical issues. But other than that, it's fairly safe to use as long as we're working with reasonable dosage levels.
Wow, this is very incredible.
Yeah, so you asked me a question that I can keep going because we haven't even talked about what are the experiential effects of it, but that gives us an idea of what it is as a tryptamine and how it functions in the body.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we definitely are. We are going to go down that path. So it'll kind of be I guess, a long drawn out answer, but in the best of ways, because we're answering so many different questions that people are going to have. A lot of people are already familiar with things like marijuana and the experiences that they go through with that, or even there's a lot of availability now for like chocolate mushrooms in a social setting, party doses and things like that. So some people have tried mushrooms before and are familiar with getting some sort of vision and things like that. With DMT, and we can be as specific as saying 5-MeO, what kind of experiences should people expect to feel or hear or see, experience as they're going, using that kind of modality for a treatment?
Yeah, I think first I will just sort of describe what it is not. In some ironic ways, it's actually more similar to cannabis than it would be to other psychedelics, in the sense that when we ingest cannabis, we often feel like an alteration of our sense of time and space, our sense of energy. We find that we resonate with certain things, like listening to music. It becomes more engrossing, but they're not necessarily visual experiences, right? When we consume cannabis, we don't really refer to that as like an overt psychedelic with like, oh, I'm seeing lots of geometry and fractals, and here are visions, and here's all this weird stuff that's arising. Then when we get into, say, psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, and DMT, these are all using more visual forms of DMT. So again, with psilocybin mushrooms, that is 4-HO-DMT. That's what psilocybin is. So it's 4-hydroxydimethyltryptamine. And at lower levels, mushrooms, like if you're just eating like a quote-unquote party level chocolate, that you're going to feel some different energies like moving through your being. You're going to appreciate sights and sounds and smells and textures a little bit differently, but not necessarily reaching into, say, visual manifestations. But then once you up the dose of mushrooms, things get very geometric, very fractal, gradations and spectrums of colors and sounds, and that's when we enter into the psychedelic phase of the experience. Ayahuasca using DMT visually and phenomenologically is very similar to psilocybin mushrooms, because psilocybin mushrooms, like Rick Strassman many years ago, he said, well, psilocybin mushrooms are edible DMT, and ayahuasca is drinkable DMT. And then we have the pure molecule of DMT itself, which can be extracted from plants. And that, again, would be smoked or vaporized, similar to 5-MeO DMT. And once you cross a very low threshold with that, it becomes very psychedelically visual very, very quickly, where the visual aspect of it is really hyper-defined. Like that is the defining characteristic of a DMT experience, is this onrush sense of energy, and then just these full-on psychedelic visuals, and sometimes even spilling over to perceptions of, quote, alternate realities, alternate realms, beings, entities, aliens, all kinds of wild stuff. But all of these other ones that we've just talked about, what they tend to do, because the visual aspect is such an important aspect of the phenomenology of the experience, is that they alter the ego, your sense of self, but they don't override it or dissolve it. So in other words, you take mushrooms or ayahuasca and DMT, and you will experience yourself as undergoing a psychedelic experience and event. And then you will experience yourself as seeing and experiencing all different kinds of altered realities and objects and phenomenon, but it's still you experiencing these things. And it might be traumas from your past, it might be unconscious aspects of your psyche, it might be behavioral patterns that you've encountered, it could be difficult experiences that you've had and emotions around that you're releasing, but it's still you there experiencing it. So at that level, I do like to say that 99.99% of all psychedelic experiences still reside within the realm of duality. And the realm of duality, from a philosophical or spiritual or metaphysical perspective, is that there is me, and then there's everything else that is not me. So there's me, and then there's the objects of my experience and my perception. So in this normal state of consciousness, there's me, which is this person and body and the identity and the consciousness and mind that is associated with it. And that is different from the microphone, it's different from the computer, it's different from you, Amy, it's different from the people who are listening. And that objects and experiences can come and go, and I can say, oh, what's that? Here I am. Oh, there it goes. But it's still all filtered through the perspective of being me. 5-MeO-DMT, in contrast, is the only psychedelic molecule out there that really, truly, consistently has the power and energetic efficacy to completely override the energetic structures that are the human ego within really just a few seconds. So it's a very startling experience where you might smoke it or vaporize it, and even as you're taking in the hit, the ego will go, oh man, it's happening. And then the ego will say, I think I'm dying. Oh my God, I'm dissolving, and all of reality is dissolving. And if the individual can choose to surrender and relax and trust that experience, which is not a given by any means, but if the individual can do that, what will happen is all of the energetic patterning and structures of the ego will dissolve because they're being overwhelmed by these very powerful energies. And then the individual can move into what is called a non-dual experience, where there's no longer a sense of me and everything else, me and the world, me and not me, where it becomes this totality of experience where there is only one unitary sense of being that exists within this space. And this unitary being is the pure energy of unconditional love. It is perfectly self-aware. It is eternal. It is infinite. And it is unconditioned and unstructured by what we normally think of as subject and object, self and world. It's because of this property that way back in 2008, after I had my first experience with it, and when I would tell people about 5-MeO-DMT, and again, at that point, most people had never really heard of it, so they'd say, do you mean DMT? And I'd say, no, that's a different molecule. That's different. It's a very different experience. At that point, DMT already had the nickname of being, quote, the spirit molecule. It was given to it by Rick Strassman. And so at that point, I decided that as a convenient point of reference and contrast, I'm going to start calling 5-MeO-DMT the God molecule. And I don't mean that in a religious sense, but I mean it in a phenomenological, experiential sense, where your individuated sense of self, your ego, dies, and then you find that there is only one universal consciousness and being, and that that is what you actually are, and that in your lived experience as an individual, it is this universal consciousness and being that is filtered down into your unique perspective of being you as actualized through the body that this consciousness is now filtered through. And also the life through which this body has lived has been filtered through. But in reality, there's actually only one universal consciousness and being that is continuously interacting with itself through the guise of self and other, me and not me, this, that, right, wrong, good, bad, light, dark, etc., etc., etc. But it's actually one totality. And this is where 5-MeO-DMT excels, that it has this potential to completely take us out of the construct of who it is that we think we are, including all of our hangups, all of our fears, all of our projections, all of our attachments, all of our regrets, all the places that we are self-conscious, self-limiting, self-editing, self-hating, self-loathing, and takes us beyond all of that so that we can actually experience the fundamental ground of being directly and immediately without any need for a guru, teacher, holy book, religion, ritual, practice. It just drops us right into the oceanic nature of being. And then as the energy starts to wear off, which is at most usually within about 15 minutes, sometimes it happens a lot more quickly than that, whereas the energy dies down, the patterns of the ego are able to reassert themselves at that point. This is a point where people often describe themselves as, quote, waking back up or regaining consciousness or, quote, coming back into their body. And suddenly they remember, oh yeah, I'm that guy named Martin, and this is my life, and this is the world that I live in. But during this temporary, transitory time period, there is no self, there is no world, there's just the totality of being. And so, yeah, I use the word God, but I don't come from any particular religious or spiritual background. I'm not trying to imply any particular religion. In fact, as someone who has studied religions and has his PhD in the topic, I don't feel that any religion is actually a good fit for this experience, that there are no perfect matches out there. So I'm not promoting a religious view, and I'm not promoting a mythological view of like some being that is transcendent and lives off in the clouds somewhere, that this actually is everything. And that includes you and I right here, right now, this very moment. And it includes everybody who's listening. It includes the phone or the computer that they're listening on. It includes the sound of my voice. It includes their heartbeat. It includes their thoughts in this very moment. It's all expressions of this one universal being. So I just found that using the word God was a lot easier than explaining all of that. So that was back in 2008 when I gave it that moniker for 5-MeO-DMT, and that has actually spread around the world at this point, where a lot of people refer to it that way. And then, of course, again, we have toad medicine, and then a little bit more recently, the pure molecule of 5-MeO-DMT is sometimes called Jaguar. I personally don't really like that as a name, because I feel it's not.
Sounds cheap. Almost sounds like out of the Anchorman, you know, when he's got like the panther or whatever perfume. Yeah, it sounds cheap doing it with the Jaguar, but I definitely, and just in my own experience, can totally relate to why it would be called the God molecule. Wow. Yeah. I heard you say recently, listening to you speak on a different podcast that you were on, you labeled 5-MeO-DMT as providing an energetic recalibration experience. And I would love to learn a little bit more in detail what you mean by that. So as someone's in the medicine, I even heard you talk about bilateral movement. What is the body doing? What is the mind doing during this experience? And I asked this because mine was so profound, and it's a little bit selfish, but also just so the listeners know what types of experience they might go through physically and mentally when they're consuming this type of modality.
Okay, it's a great question, and I'll just start by saying that there are many different aspects of giving a comprehensive answer to that. But we'll just start with the idea that everything you've ever experienced and are experiencing right now is a form of energy. And sometimes even using the word energy, people start thinking, well, you're talking about like some metaphysical energy, like subtle bodies. Are you talking about chakras? Are you talking about chi? And no, everything is energy. So we can just start with the obvious. Okay, right now I have a light over here. And we can see if I move my hand in between me and the light, what's happening? I'm disrupting the light. Light is an energy. These are waves of energy that produces this effect. And then my eyes are able to take these waves and creates it into a visual picture. And my brain creates a visual picture of this is what I'm seeing in the world. And most of the time, it's relatively accurate, right? If it weren't relatively accurate, we would not survive as a species. And this does not mean that I see things the same way that a bee sees things, or that a whale sees things, or that a crab sees things, because we all have different structures in our eyes, and eyes have evolved many different times within the grand scope of evolution. But it still works on the same principle that there are light waves, there are these energies, and that we are able to have these receptors that then creates a functional image of the world that allows us to navigate as subject and object within the world of duality. Now, sound. That obviously also are just waves. Sounds are compression waves that are moving through a material such as air or water. That's why there's no sound out in space. That's why sci-fi movies are never accurate, because you can hear ships blowing up and they got the cool sounds as they're zipping around. There's no sound in space because there's no medium through which those compression waves to travel through. Light, however, does not need a medium to travel through. So light is something quite special and unique in terms of energy. So I am compressing sound waves in a certain way that you and your listeners are able to recognize. Oh, that's the English language. But this is all just compression of sound. That's the only thing that's actually happening here. And then our brains say, oh, he's saying words. I know what those words mean, and that's what he said. Then if we're dealing with touch, then like we can feel, oh, I'm feeling my desk right now, and it's kind of a cold day, so it's like the surface of the desk is slightly cool. Well, temperature is simply a matter of vibration, how fast molecules are vibrating, which again is just energy. And then if we even get down to what the hell are molecules, they're just packets of vibrating energy that we break it down into subatomic particles and atoms and quarks and all of that. Those are just little packets of vibrating energy. That's all that anything is. And then when we're dealing with our internal state, or as a person. Now, obviously, my body runs off of energy. That just like everybody else's body, I have a heartbeat. And that's actually a small electrical pulse that actually creates fractal patterns that determines, like, if that little pulse stops, if that energy stops, I'm kaput, right? This is like, he's dead. Like, there's no heartbeat. Dude's dead. And brain waves, whenever we're thinking thoughts, whenever we are processing reality, we are producing brain waves. And there's actually little electrical signals that are passing around through our brain, and those electrical signals then move out through our body through these fractal branch patterns, which we call our nervous system. And that's how we feel and sense things. That's how we contemplate our experience. And then internally, we, of course, have emotions, which are energies where if we're feeling excited, we're like, yeah, I'm feeling excited. And if we're feeling depressed, then the energy is really low and down and, oh, I'm feeling really sad. Or then we might need to cry. We might need to laugh. We might need to yell. We might need to scream. These are all just expressions of energy. Now, the human ego itself is nothing but a collection of patterns of energy, which are ways that we have chosen to define ourselves with how we think, what we believe, what we want, what we like, what we don't want, and then also how we choose to express ourselves, how we embody ourselves as a character, how we express ourselves, how we use our bodies, how we interact between subject and object, self and other, how we communicate. These are all just energy. So it's not hippie when somebody says like, hey, I really like your energy. What they're referring to is I like the way you carry and express yourself. And that all of these things taken together are just these patterns of energy. But by definition, they're all limited. For one, we are largely limited to like act like a human being. Like if somebody were to run around and start barking, you would say, maybe you need to go see a psychiatrist or something, because like the energy that you're embodying and expressing, like that's not normal human stuff. Like you think you're a dog, right? And then not only are we conditioned by being human, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I mean, human beings are great. But we're also conditioned by our family, where our parents say, don't do that, be like this. And we're conditioned by our religion, culture, society, politics. We are conditioned by the historical time period that we grow up in. We're conditioned by the influences that we take in through music, media, movies, television, the internet channels that we watch, all of that stuff. So we're constantly adding to our identity and our patterns. And then as we grow, we settle into these are the patterns that I identify with and that make me feel like me. And unfortunately, a lot of times these patterns get built around harmful or traumatic events or external forces that intervene in our capacity to authentically be ourselves. So we'll give just like an obvious example. A child who's being raised in a fundamentalist Christian family starts to suspect that maybe they are attracted to someone of the same sex. And then they go to church and they hear about how God hates and how they're all going to hell and they're all pedophiles and they're all sick and twisted and they're mentally deficient and they're morally corrupt. And so then that child grows up hating him or herself and having to hide how they truly feel and where they're truly authentically energetically drawn towards. And then maybe later in life they'll go through a period of, now I'm shedding my religion and I'm coming out and I'm embracing who I am. But even then it might even go into an extreme, because if somebody has been repressed for a long period of time, they often need to go somewhat in an indulgent way over into the other extreme. You know, it's like people who really want to eat chocolate but they won't let themselves do it. And then finally they hit the breaking point and then suddenly they're binging on chocolate. It's like, oh, I'm going to eat as much as I can. So many of us have developed egoic patterns. And again, this is a really dramatic, kind of obvious case, but many of us have developed egoic patterns that are not actually in alignment with what we authentically think and feel and understand about ourselves, and might be based on wounds, false information, or highly conditioned information that is not necessarily reflective of reality itself. So, now, 5-MeO-DMT itself is this experience of infinite, eternal, unconditioned energy, which can also be described as the energy of unconditional love. And this is very different than normal human romantic love, for one thing, because we say, well, I love this person, but not that person. I love this, but I don't love that. So most of our experience of love is unconditional. Is conditional. Unconditional love is, it's all good, or it's all permitted, it's all okay. So in other words, this true energy of being doesn't take sides, doesn't have preferences, doesn't either praise or condemn, that it's more this universal acceptance of being. So when we consume 5-MeO-DMT and this infinite energy has this potential to arise within our experience, if we are holding on to hate, fear, judgment, either as applied to others or to ourselves, it will find these places, or places where we have performed in such a way that is not actually congruent with what we authentically are. So for example, someone who is homosexual but is living in a closeted lifestyle and maybe even denying it to themselves, that they might come out of their experience and say, I'm gay, right? So it finds all of these places because it's this infinitely expanding energy. So anywhere that we're like, oh, no, don't look at that, don't feel that, don't think that way, it's going to find all of that. So this energy, when it overrides the conscious part of the ego, for one thing, it allows the opportunity for these unconscious parts of the ego, places where we have deeply embedded, ingrained beliefs and patterns about ourselves. It gives them the opportunity to come to the surface and work themselves out. But this is done in a way that often is extraordinarily dramatic, because the conscious part of the ego goes offline. And then the unconscious part of the ego is suddenly, like maybe you have somebody who, maybe they seem to be living a really good life and they seem well adjusted and they seem happy and quote unquote normal. And then you give them 5-MeO-DMT and they go through this experience where they feel like they're dying. And then all of a sudden, what comes out is they start screaming, I hate myself. I wish I'd never be born. And I hate you, God. And I hate you, world. And I hate you, Mom. I hate you, Dad. Whatever it may be. And it starts to actually process out that, like, these are things they've never said before, but actually have secretly been feeling their entire lives.
When I
So,
went through my experience, I had this all on video. I was screaming, like just screaming and screaming and screaming. And then I was like chanting in some weird form of a language and, making like hoo, hee, ha sounds,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
just like, where is this even coming from? I would never do this. So okay, I'm starting to like put the pieces together here, but keep going,
Right,
please. This
right.
is really
So
helpful.
exactly. So that's the conscious part of Amy that says like, whoa, I would never do that. But see, the whole persona of Amy is riding on top of an infinite well of unconditioned energy that doesn't care if it looks, acts, or expresses like either Amy would look, act, or express, or even as a quote unquote normal human being would look, act, or express. That all of these energies, they suddenly become accessed. And the way that we process energy is through our bodies. So then, yes, people start screaming. People, quote unquote, speak in tongues, or what I just like to call energy language, where they're like,
Yeah.
and it's just pouring out of them, or they're crying, or they're doing these weird breathing and grunting, or it becomes very animalistic, or for some people it becomes very sexual, for some it becomes violent, for some it becomes aggressive, for some it's just this outpouring of grief and trauma. I mean, there's so many possibilities, but the thing is, we have to remember that all of us walking around, we are just interacting with the very surface of people, of what we want other people to see in most cases. And then what we're doing is we're kind of taking off the cap and we're saying, well, what's really going on in here? So I do like to say that people's first full experience of 5-MeO DMT, not just a small quote unquote handshake dose, but like a full release dose, I like to say this is the diagnostic round. Because
Wow.
we're going to get the conscious part of the ego and we're just going to set it aside, and then we're going to see what's actually going on within this person. What kind of energies is this person experiencing? Because what 5-MeO DMT does is it amplifies everything to the infinite degree. So you can take someone who maybe if you ask them like, oh, how are you doing? They're like, oh, I'm really sad. And then you give them 5-MeO, and all of a sudden they're wailing and crying, and just tears are squirting out of their eyes. But what it does is it allows for these powerfully transformative, cathartic events to take place, where unprocessed, unrecognized, unacknowledged energies within our being get a chance to express themselves and sort out and move through. Okay, so that's one level of what's going on there. Now, another aspect that I always like to emphasize is that there are different forms of embodiment from whether we are either operating from a dualistic state of being or whether we are operating from a non-dual state of being. And that these things are embodied and expressed very clearly in different ways. So when we're operating from a dualistic sense of self, which is our normal egoic identity, me, not me, me, the world, self, not self, that everything is energetically divided into asymmetries, where we say, I like this, I don't like that. I want this, I don't want that. I love this, I hate that. I want to be like this, I don't want to be like that. I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do that. So we're constantly dividing things internally into sides, and then we're choosing a side and saying, this is what I want. So it's very asymmetrical that way in terms of our inner experience. And also just the asymmetry of, or there's me here, and then there's everything else is not me over there. So I'm on this side, everything else is on that side. Then in terms of how we interact with objects in the world, which is subject-object relationship, I like to give these really easy examples that if I want to take notes about our conversation right now, I'm going to reach over with my left hand and grab my pen, and I'm going to hold my paper with my right hand, and I'm going to take notes. So my left and right sides of the body are engaging with the world differently so that the subject can manipulate an object in order to achieve a goal or intention that I, the subject, have. Or if I want to drink water, I'm going to reach over with my right hand because my glass of water is over here, and then I'll drink and then I'll put it down. So most all the ways that we interact with ourselves internally and externally is through these asymmetries. Now, when the ego completely gets out of the way and is no longer actively running the vehicle of the self, and this happens very dramatically on 5-MeO DMT, what happens is people's bodies then start to exhibit clear bilateral symmetry, mirrored bilateral symmetry within the body. So in other words, the most common thing that happens, first of all, is if people really open up, they go into a star position. Well, they'll fall back, and then they open up, and there's this nice symmetry between the left and right sides of the body. And then sometimes the energy is felt as directing the body, and so then these movements start to take place, which is usually these kind of rolling over movements, and people's hands come together in the center and they separate, but what you don't ever see is one hand going up and another down. You don't see people crossing the center line of their body because they're not relating to subject and object. And it's just this expression and embodiment of energy in that moment. And this also tends to come with screams of ecstasy, crying, toning, again, glossolalia, all of these different kind of energetic events take place.
And I'll just quickly say I'll insert either a video or a photo of because what you were saying I did both on my psilocybin journey and DMT, where thank goodness I had a video to even acknowledge this. But when I saw the footage back, that's what I was doing. I was doing these movements with my hands and my arms and rolling, and it just, I didn't know where it was coming from or why I would be doing. There's no way for me to tell anybody what I was doing in that moment that would create these movements in my mind. But I'll put some photos and video potentially in either during this episode or at the tail end, so I don't interrupt the audio, so that you guys can see, those of you listening at home, what he means by this. I can share what it looks like in play. But please continue.
Yeah, it's great that you've had the opportunity to have these kinds of expressions and embodiments take place, because it doesn't happen to everyone. And it can be very hard to communicate to somebody else because, for one, usually when it's happening, the ego is not present. So literally, Amy wasn't doing that. She wasn't there to do that. Yet still it was showing up within your body, right? This was happening. So, I mean, this raises... hopefully it should raise deep philosophical questions about, well, who am I? Who actually is running this vehicle of this body? If it's not Amy, who is it? What is it? And what I love about this distinction about these kinds of movements and embodiments is that they're not historically or culturally conditioned in any way, shape, or form. In other words, it doesn't matter what somebody's background is. It doesn't matter what their prior experience is. It doesn't matter where they come from or who it is that they think that they are. If the ego gets out of the way, and if the body is open enough for the energy to move it, it will look the same in every single person on the planet. So this is a universal presentation of energy that is not conditioned by the ego. And when it happens, usually people don't remember it because the ego is gone, and then the ego comes back. So especially with 5-MeO DMT, this is where it's most likely to show up. But as you pointed out, it's actually not limited there. It can show up on any psychedelic, and it can even show up outside of a psychedelic event, though it's very rare for it to do so, at least spontaneously on its own without a psychedelic introduction. Is that you can ask people like, so what do you think you were doing during that time period? And they'll say, oh, well, I was just lying there. I don't think I was doing anything. And then, yeah, you can show them a video. So like, look, actually you were moving. I was like, well, I wasn't doing that. And that's right, because you are not actually your ego. Your ego is the part of you that thinks it's you.
I had like pulled my knees back when I was administered the smoke of the 5-MeO DMT. I inhaled it through the device, the vaporizer device. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting cross-legged at the time. I had 4 facilitators around me. One put a mask, pushed the mask down over my eyes right after I'd inhaled. And I was holding the smoke in my lungs, and they tipped me back so I could lay down, and my hands were on my knees. And throughout the experience, I was like pulling my knees and my legs back, almost like I was giving birth, and just like letting out these really intense screams. And then I was doing like the hand movements and the rolling and stuff, but it was a very, very it's kind of hard to watch. It was very releasing and cathartic. Like I was just moving and yelling. It's traumatic to watch, actually, because of the screaming. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, are you in pain? Are you struggling? And to your very valid point, just in practice here, what was happening with my body was not what was happening with my mind. They were totally disconnected.
Yeah.
If you had asked me as I came out of it, I had no recollection of what I was doing with my body at all, only except for the fact that I have a video to prove it. But my mind was doing something completely different. So it's shocking what can happen with your body during this experience.
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why I do encourage people to video record their session with 5-MeO-DMT, because almost everyone, if you're working at a sufficient dose level, you will go through an experience like this in some capacity, where then you can go back and look at the video and you're like, I didn't know I was doing any of that. And what is it that's going on there? So this is one of the things that I do as an integration specialist who works with people with 5-MeO-DMT, is that they can bring me videos of their session, and then I will go through it frame by frame, and we will talk about what is going on energetically there to help them come to an understanding. Like, so kind of what you're describing is one of these phenomenons that is actually very common, where in a sense, in going through this ego death experience, you're actually giving yourself the opportunity to rebirth yourself through the being of your body, and go through all those energies of giving birth to yourself. This is something that tends to show up, like you're describing, the knees coming up, sort of the presentation of the genitalia. This is something that tends to happen more with women in this sense, where because their bodies are already conditioned to give birth. I mean, that's part of being a female. And so as these energies are activated, that many women go through this kind of rebirth kind of experience. And then it can also be releasing trauma from their own birth or the birth of their kids. And it can work on all these levels simultaneously, because it's all a fractal expression of the one, so everything's related to everything else anyway. But these are very, very common on 5-MeO-DMT. And when it comes to this distinction between asymmetrical movements and symmetrical movements, I've really been the only person to identify this, and I've been talking about it for years, and I recommend consciously working in bilateral symmetry through these experiences, and then you can apply that to work with any other psychedelic to make these non-dual states of energetic being and processing available. And so actually that gets us back to the original question, is like, well, what do you mean by the energetic recalibration and the energetic reformatting that takes place? That through the construct of the ego, almost all of us have formatted ourselves into a less than authentic and fully integrated version of ourselves. In other words, we are constantly carrying around our baggage, our projections, our attachments, our wounds, our issues, our limitations. And at a general level, I like to say that human beings basically we've been running around like what I call God toddlers, and that we're not really experienced at being God adults. And that this is a process through which you can release the structures of these dysfunctional patterns within yourself, so that you reformat into a cleaner, more integrated, more grounded, more authentic state. But it often involves these really dramatic energetic processes that occur. And yes, from the outside, from somebody watching, it can seem like, oh my God, that's horrific. But from the inside, it's like, I've never been through anything better in my life, because even though it was like totally out of my control, I feel better now. It's amazing. I feel more connected to myself. I feel more integrated. I feel more grounded and more available to be myself.
The next day, or not even the next day, I think it was like a couple hours after, because to your point earlier, these are only 15 to 20 minute sessions, before it wears off and you regain your ego or your sense of self and presence. And, you can go back to resuming normal activity.
Yeah.
I think I walked in the retreat house that I was in. I went through this retreat with 10 other women, and I just remember taking like such a deep breath, and I was like, wow, I can actually breathe. I've never breathed so deeply in my life as I did immediately following Bufo. Like, I just felt such incredible release. I was in a state of shock for probably 24, 48 hours just because I'm just a little bit more color. Like, I had this, like, I don't know how else to describe it other than this download of like, reliving life after life of being a warrior and killing and being killed life after life after life after life. That's kind of this, I don't know, the vision that I had during the Bufo experience. And I just had this massive shock about it, like, what did I just go through? Like, I almost didn't want, I did 2 rounds of it back to back, and I almost didn't want to do the second round because I was in such shock from the first round. But I'm so glad I did go through it again. I would go through it a third time because it's just so releasing, and I can just breathe so much more deeply after that energetic recalibration.
Yeah. And it points to the fact that most of us are carrying around a level of tension that we're not actually aware of. So even when we're in our most relaxed states and we think like, oh, I'm really relaxed now, what shows up through a 5-MeO experience when we really relax into the full ecstatic infinite nature of being is that it really clearly becomes the case like, I've never actually been relaxed in my life. I've never actually taken a free breath in my entire life, that I've always been bracing and holding some kind of tension. And so like here in what you've just shared, so I take what I call this is a radical non-dual perspective on all of this. That, in other words, I myself personally, I do not believe in past lives or reincarnation. But then you have an experience like this, and it's kind of, well, then what is that? So I do like to say the only one who reincarnates is God. And so this one universal being is busy being everyone and everything, all space and all time, including right now, this moment. So there's not actually a soul that differentiates me from you in any way. But what it's like I was saying earlier, that all things are part of fractal patterns, meaning that the same themes get expressed in different contexts and in different shapes, but relate to each other. So as you, as a veteran, are going through releasing the patterns and the tensions and the blind spots and the holdings that have been created through being a veteran, having gone through combat experience or going through training and all of that and all the conditioning, which obviously there's a lot of conditioning that comes with that. So there's a lot of conditioning to break down. As you're going through that, then you, as interacting with yourself between the character of Amy and the universal being that you are, that what you can also do is you present yourselves with, oh, and do you recognize the pattern here? See the pattern here? See it here? See it here? See it here? Here, 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 here. Because the truth is, human beings have been going around killing each other for hundreds of thousands of years. There have been warriors and war and combat for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So this is a deeply ingrained pattern within the human animal and within the human psyche. And so as you are encountering and releasing all this from your personal self, you can also present aspects of it to yourself in a transpersonal way, which might be experienced as previous lives or other modes of being. For some people, it could present as, oh, I am releasing all the trauma around sexual abuse around all people from all times. Or it can be other more transcendental-like experiences. But see, we're always grappling with how am I, as an individual, receiving and processing the reality of this, and that it's easier for the mind to work through specific content and presentations than it is just through amorphous energy. That, in other words, we human beings, we are prone to symbolizing, concretizing, and narrative structures that helps us make sense out of experiences. If we can tell a story about it, like, yeah, there was an endless line of soldiers that I was encountering. So, but this is all aspects of yourself. It's all the universal self that in the unconditioned state also recognizes that, yeah, some people are warriors, but that doesn't mean that you have to hate yourself, and it doesn't mean that you have to punish yourself, and it doesn't mean that you have to kill yourself. That this is part of being a human being, and this is part of the reality that we experience, and that sometimes might even be necessary. So that what we want to do is actually make peace with ourselves, so that regardless of where we came from or what we've experienced, that we can still say, you know what, I find myself worthy of experiencing and receiving and giving love, because that is the heart of what I am, is this universal heart of unconditional love. And so I need to apply that to myself first and foremost, and then can apply it to others at the external level. And it plays out through, again, these really dramatic, energetic events. And just one point that I wanted to circle back on is that, I've been talking about this importance of symmetry versus asymmetry for a number of years. But one of my books that really put it into a lot of detail is my 2017 book, Entheogenic Liberation. I think it's over here.
Yeah, let's see it. I'll hyperlink it too.
Yeah,
So
that's this book of mine. And when I wrote this book, I was contacted by somebody who had been serving 5-MeO-DMT in basically in the southern United States. It was not a place I had expected to hear from someone. And he said that he had been facilitating and working with 5-MeO-DMT for 25 years at that point in 2017 when he read the book. And he said that because no one had ever pointed out before this difference between symmetry versus asymmetry, he said, I am now, like in retrospect, I can see that I've been observing this in my sessions with clients with 5-MeO-DMT for 25 years, and I never made the connection of what was going on there. So it just allowed him to completely reframe what he himself had experienced as a facilitator. So I do think it's just a fundamental aspect of our being, this difference between asymmetry and symmetry. And I think I do like to say, like, it's the most important thing that I have to communicate about the energetics of this, because it's so fundamental and universal that if we can learn how to really work with it, that it provides a very useful tool for encountering and processing energy in a way that is free from the interference of the ego. And therefore it's a really profound gift of working.
It's so interesting too. I guess I'm really thrilled that we had this conversation, because as you look at even the most basic things, elements in the world, water, the world is just comprised of geometric shapes. When you freeze water, you get these beautiful snowflakes and crystals, and patterns, but they're all like geometric and they're reflecting equal sides, and just the symmetry is so beautiful. And so it's interesting when you apply that to the human body and its natural state, when you're removing that ego layer, and as you said earlier, just kind of opening up and looking in there, like what's really going on, how these shapes will perform. And this kind of leads into my next question, which is around like legality and more access and studying these treatments and modalities of healing, for medicinal purposes for not only military veterans, but first responders, those with anxiety and depression and some of these other issues. This is obviously an extremely profound healing modality. It's been around long before Western medicine has been a thing. This has been around in indigenous cultures and societies for, as far back as we even probably give credit for. Where are we at today with, having this studied by colleges and universities and putting, science behind these to truly study what's happening during these treatments and how profound of an experience it can be for using it as a healing modality, et cetera. Where are we at with that today?
Yeah, well, we are currently at a place that is a lot more productive than it was. But we're still really just at the very beginnings of where all this research can go. So just to put it into historical perspective, that when psychedelics were, quote, first discovered within Western cultures, would be like early to mid last century, when mescaline in particular was first identified as a psychedelic compound, and then the discovery of LSD, that originally psychiatrists were very, very interested in mescaline and LSD and looking at them as tools to psychotherapy, and people were experimenting with different modalities of helping people with psychiatric disorders and applying them even for drug addictions, things like that. Like even Alcoholics Anonymous was started by an LSD trip. So the original idea was that the quote, the surrender to a higher power that is promoted within Alcoholics Anonymous and now a lot of subsequent addiction programs, that higher power was actually LSD. But that didn't get implemented because then back in the 1970s, we had Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, who wanted to put his enemies in prison and wanted an excuse to be able to do that, created the Controlled Substances Act and started the war on drugs. And it has since come out that he is quoted as saying that he wanted a reason to put Mexicans in prison and also hippies in prison. And so he made marijuana illegal and made psychedelics such as mescaline and LSD illegal as well, and made a lot of other psychedelics and substances illegal at that point as well, and put them into the Schedule 1 category. Now, the Schedule 1 category says that a substance needs to be a narcotic. Technically, a narcotic is something that makes you lose consciousness or puts you to sleep. That narco means to sleep, right? To be put to sleep. So a narcotic is something that puts you to sleep. Psychedelics don't do that. They're not narcotics, but anyway, they're Schedule 1. Also, Schedule 1, high potential for addiction. Psychedelics are not physically addictive. You do not develop dependency on any of these known psychedelics, so also does not apply. Has a high potential for abuse. That's subjective. That's arguable about what do you mean, what counts as abuse, who decides what is abuse versus what is use, and then also has no medical value or no medical application. So even putting LSD in there from the very beginning obviously was a sham because psychiatrists were using LSD and they were finding it to be very efficacious in helping patients with severe psychiatric disorders. So the whole thing was a sham. There's no part of Schedule 1 that psychedelics could legitimately be associated with, in my opinion. Maybe on the abuse issue, but even then, in terms of sociological studies, most have found that use of psychedelics is self-limiting in the sense that they're usually intense. They're not necessarily always fun. They do require a lot of hard work and reflection and introspection. So most use of psychedelics actually tends to be self-limiting and therefore not really in alignment with what we think of as abuse, where like, oh, I can't wait to go home to shoot up again. And I'm not going to go to work, and I'm going to neglect my parental duties because I just got to shoot something up and got to go back to the bliss state. So for a number of years, then, because all of these substances were made illegal at the federal level, and then also there were international laws put in place through the UN that made all of this illegal, any scientific research into psychedelics around the world ground to a halt. And there was no psychedelic research done anywhere in the world for virtually a generation.
Wow.
Then,
such a shame.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. But that was the effect of the war on drugs. So the war on drugs, I mean, if you ever were under the illusion that it was to help people, hopefully this dispels that pretty quickly. But things started to change. In the mid-1990s, the first change was through Rick Strassman, who actually applied to the federal government that he wanted to just research the subjective effects of DMT on human subjects. And that was the first scientific research, which didn't have a lot of ambitions. It was just like, let's give people DMT and see what they report. That was the first actual research that was done about any psychedelic in a generation.
And this was when, just for context of, timing frame-wise?
That was in the early to mid-1990s.
Wow. So it's so recent, and in the grand scheme of things and how long, pharmaceutical industry has, been pushing out things like SSRIs and all of these other crazy pharmaceutical drugs. We've got something as natural as DMT and we just started researching it in the 90s. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It's not scientific.
No.
And it's not good social policy. But anyway, that kind of opened the doorway. And then slowly more researchers, usually through universities or even sometimes pharmaceutical companies, they started looking at, well, okay, can we do research on psychedelics? And it really wasn't until the early 2000s that then we entered into this new phase, excuse me, of really like the 2010 is kind of around the time period, a little bit before then, but that's what has now been identified as this is the quote unquote psychedelic renaissance, meaning that enough universities and doctors and scientists and researchers said, we want to apply to study the actions of psychedelic drugs and the potential therapeutic applications. And at this point, there are departments of psychedelic studies. There are lots of different researchers that are looking at are these safe to use, particularly been looking very closely at like psilocybin, MDMA. There are institutes looking at the actions of 5-MeO-DMT. There are other places that are now looking for the potential of taking some of these psychedelic molecules and can we make some changes to them that reduces their quote-unquote psychedelic effects but still have strong therapeutic potential in terms of like relieving anxiety, depression, stress, trauma, things like that. So this is now around the world, this is something that is happening. So just like the shutdown happened around the world, sort of this resurgence has happened at the same time. And then at the cultural level, outside of research institutes, there's been just a groundswell of interest in psychedelics for spirituality, personal growth, transformation, as well as the therapeutic applications of healing, overcoming depression, trauma, PTSD, all of that. And even more recently, just in the past few years now, there has been the development of quote-unquote entheogenic churches within the United States where people are using the 1994 Religious Freedom Restoration Act as grounds to seek exemption from federal drug laws around the serving of these psychedelic sacraments. Also, in the past couple decades, there has been the growth of psychedelic retreat centers in places where there has not been as draconian drug laws as we have in the United States. We really do like to put people in prison here in the United States, the land of the free. We love a good excuse to put people in prison, and drugs have been a big part of that. But not every country has followed suit. So a lot of countries have had more lax and open rules and regulations around the use and serving of psychedelics. So places like Mexico, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, there's a lot more access. But all of this is happening now. So there's the retreat centers, there's the underground facilitators, there's the underground psychotherapists, there are then the university researchers, and there's the research institutes. So it's really happening at all levels of society at this point. And then, a few years ago, we had Michael Pollan, this food writer, come along, and a best-selling author. And he decided that he was going to write this book, How to Change Your Mind, where he went and he experienced different psychedelics. And that has become very popular and mainstream and introduced a whole new generation of people to psychedelics who never would have.
Netflix show, too.
Yeah, this Netflix show.
Netflix show, yeah.
And so this is probably the largest growing demographic within the quote-unquote psychedelic world, is that formerly this was something that people of alternative spirituality did and hippies did or counterculturalists did. But now through sort of this mainstreaming and sort of media presence around psychedelics, that we're now seeing a whole new group of people who, people in their adult professional lives say, I've never had any interest in a psychedelic, and now I'm interested in it because I've heard that actually there's like lots of positive benefits. And then also another major area of growth, which this would be your demographic, would be veterans who are seeking help reintegrating into society and dealing with the traumas that they have experienced through either combat or deployment, and often very frustrated by mainstream or easily available psychotherapeutic modalities, which often do not resolve issues. At best, they might help you manage symptoms, whereas many people do feel that through these entheogenic or psychedelic therapies that they're actually able to transform and resolve their issues at a very deep level, which is not to say that these are just magic bullets. But as you yourself have shared, you go through a really dramatic, really cathartic, deep and transformative experience in a short period of time. And you do feel the impact of that like right away. So that these
Immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll just say, I think it's really important just to emphasize what you're saying here because it's so critical. I spent literally years trying to get help. I was over in Afghanistan 2010. I came back January 2012. And I had the worst decade of my life coming back into society. And the military literally just throws bottles of Ambien for you to sleep and get addicted to. And they throw you bottles of, Wellbutrin or all these SSRIs or different, medications for you to be on that just barely tap, any kind of consciousness for you. You're just dealing with the after effects of serious trauma, and you're depressed and you're close to suicide, and you're just barely surviving. Your family's ruined. A lot of military veterans, like 80%, this is a real statistic, like 80% of marriages in the military end in divorce. It's really traumatic for a lot of people. It really ruins their lives and relationships. And talk therapy does nothing for most people. They spend years even trying to get appointments in the VA. They have brain scans and all these different things, and nothing helps. And I personally am attesting, like I had the worst 10 years of my life trying to deal with the after effects of trauma. And, some traumas even from my childhood. And 2 months of time of going through the retreat and then the following 2 months of doing integration work I'm on 0 medications, none, absolutely none. I don't even use, sleep, nothing. Just removing even things like caffeine. Like I am the best I've ever been in my entire life. I am anxiety free. I have no depression. I have no ideations of ending my life. Like I am thriving. And that is 100% thank you to psychedelic therapies and an excellent integration program, which I think is really key to say. You can't just sit in your living room by yourself, consume psychedelics and think that you're going to be healed. The true work is the 360-degree approach to your life and to doing solid integration work with experts like yourself. So I just want to echo that for my audience here, that what you're saying is so true. And in practice, in real life, in real examples, these therapies and these treatments are so profoundly important to be legalized and to have access to for veterans, first responders, those who have been through traumatic events, et cetera, to reintegrate into life. Because, what otherwise, I don't know if there would have ever been an end date to the traumas that I was going through had it not been for these therapies. And it's a shame what the pharmaceutical industry is doing to try to stop the legalization of some of these modalities, because obviously it's competition, right? You can grow these things in your underneath your house, and so you don't need the pharmaceutical industry. And so anyway, I'll pause there. But what you're saying is it's so important.
Yeah, well, something that I would like to kind of highlight that you shared right there is this whole concept of integration. And for most people who are kind of getting into the psychedelic world these days, like it gets used all the time, this term integration, and promoted as a necessary part of the transformative and healing process. And even there, it can be surprising to hear that this is a new term. This is actually even a new concept, and it's a reflection of where we are culturally and as a society and our understanding of how to apply these for therapeutic benefits. Because, when we go back into traditional cultures, like culture that has been eating psilocybin mushrooms for thousands of years, that was so integrated into their daily life and into their normal experience that if we had gone and asked them, like, well, what do you do for integration? They would be like, well, what do you mean? Like, this is part of our life. This is how we understand ourselves. This is what we do. Or you go to an ayahuasca culture and you could ask them, what's integration? They'll go, oh, what does that word even mean? Like, isn't every moment part of integrating our experience into who we are and our place in the world? And then if we look back at, say, the countercultural movement in the 60s and 70s, we had people like Timothy Leary, who first brought out the idea of set and setting, that if you want to have a, quote, good psychedelic experience, your mindset is important. Like what you're bringing into the event is very important. So, in other words, don't take a psychedelic when you're in the middle of a traumatic event, right? Because that's a bad mindset. And then setting is what is the context in which you are taking the psychedelic. And so these are very important, and these are still very important. But what was missing at that earlier phase of the psychedelic movement in Western culture was this idea of integration. And like when I had my first 5-MeO DMT experience back in 2008, and then had a number of experiences through 2008 and 2009, and was also attending the Santo Daime church here in Ashland, where they drink ayahuasca as a religious sacrament. These days, people ask me, what did you do for integration while you were going through your process? And my answer is, that wasn't even a word back then. Like, and I'm not saying that there wasn't the word integration in the English language. I mean, in application to the concept of what are we doing with psychedelics. So this is more of an outgrowth of the much more recent attention to the therapeutic facilitation of psychedelics. And so now we have this general overview that is promoted of, first, we have intake, preparation, and screening, where you need to inquire about what is someone's history, inform them about the actions of whatever psychedelic it is that they're planning to take, look at their medical history, look at their trauma history, look at their medication history, and then the preparatory sessions of what are prior activities that you might want to engage in before coming into a psychedelic event. And then we have the facilitation phase, where you go in and you get a treatment, or you go to a retreat, or you go to a therapy center and you receive the psychedelic at that point. And that is usually monitored and supervised by licensed therapists or by retreat workers or otherwise characterized facilitators. And then after that, then you have integration work, which can be done with a coach or with a specialist. It might be with a therapist. I mean, there's lots of different things that integration means, but it's basically the emphasis on the idea that there should be some kind of aftercare, and that it's not just about having a mind-blowing experience and then going on with your life, but actually using that as a point of reflection and as a time period and modality for making sure that those changes or those shifts actually produce lasting effects, and that you are able to move into a new mode of being. And so it's a very new concept in the world of psychedelics, and I think it's a fundamental part, particularly of the therapeutic use, where people, and we have to keep in mind, not everybody is coming to a psychedelic experience saying, I want to heal from something, or I want relief from something. That there are lots of other legitimate uses of psychedelics. They're fascinating, they're fun, they're philosophically profound, they engage aspects of our creativity and of our expression. Depending on the context, they can also be used for sexual experience. They can be used to enjoy a museum. They can be used to heighten your experience of a hike. There's lots of different applications for psychedelics, and not all of them are healing and transformation. But when we are focused specifically on targeted healing and transformation, that's where this emphasis on integration is extremely important. And I think it's great that this is now a part of the conversation and a part of the program that people are engaged in. And there's certainly a need for it. And, at this point, my most direct engagement with the psychedelic world is through the integration side of things. And I do specialize in the 5-MeO experience. And something I like to emphasize there is, like, even there, not everybody, quote unquote, needs integration. I don't think that it's a requirement, but definitely there are going to be people who really, really, really need some help and need some integration tools and need some integration reflection. So I think it's just an invaluable role that is now being cultivated and developed within the psychedelic space.
I think it's so important to have people like you that are experts in this space and in integration to unpack what some of these experiences that they went through during the psychedelic experience are. I know I have a long list of questions about things I saw, things I experienced. There's parts of my visions that I had when I was in psilocybin, as an example, that felt so I don't know, prophesial. I don't know how you say that word, but like where it was like,
Prophetic.
prophesying. I don't know. You guys can make fun of me at home for butchering that. But where it was like telling me what I was going to be experiencing in the coming months, right? And I thought that was so interesting and profound, but it's like, what does that mean? So there's all these different questions that you can leave with, or, you know, as we talked about earlier, where I had this really aggressive and intense experience with the DMT where, you know, I was screaming and lashing out. And what does that mean? And how do I integrate that? You know, how do I make sense of it? And, you know, something else I walked away with from my retreat is I went through with 10 other women. And what I noticed is some of the women that did come specifically for healing, you know, the integration process was when they got home, they felt their anxiety was gone, but they were really struggling to settle into what used to be their old life. And I know for me, as one example, like I was having huge amounts of anxiety before going to the retreat. It's one of the reasons why I went. And I did a full life cleanup, meaning I quit drinking alcohol completely. That's integration. I completely quit drinking caffeine because I was finding the caffeine was exasperating my anxiety.
Yeah.
That's integration. You know, I was being more selective about what friend circles I wanted to be around. Did I really want to go to the parties and, you know, the LA lifestyle that had a lot of drugs around and, you know, just things that weren't healthy for me? No, I didn't. Well, that's integration. So, you know, it's shedding that old skin of what you don't want to be anymore when you're going through the healing process, so you can settle into this new habits, these new habits, these new behaviors, this new way of life. And having a group around me that I could relate to, that understood the experience that I just went through, facilitators that were able to help walk me through, you know, some of the reactivations that I was experiencing with the DMT, and some of the dreams I was having that seemed very vivid and real and not like normal dreams. And, you know, being able to answer those questions, that's so important. And so to have a community around you when you're going through these types of experiences, especially if you're focused on the healing elements of using this as a medicine, as a modality to clear out old traumas and issues, it is so important to be around a community and a facilitator, or, you know, an integration expert like yourself that, you know, you can kind of be a North Star to shed some of that old skin and rebirth into your new self.
Yeah, and that's also a good argument for why it should all be legal and above board. Because in the United States, a lot of people feel that they need to hide this, or you need to travel out of the country and then you go to a retreat, but then you go back home, and then people can feel very displaced. They can feel very alone. They can feel very disconnected. Whereas, you know, if we could go to a local community center and we could do the work there, and we could do it with our neighbors, and then we can connect with people at a personal level. That I do like to say that sometimes these really powerful, especially the unitary experience, can be deeply isolating for people in an ironic way. And this, I think it's especially heightened when there has to be this, I have to travel and then I come back, but now I'm disconnected and I don't know who to reach out to. But
And it's cost prohibitive too.
Yeah. And not everybody can do that. Not everybody can go on a retreat to Peru. And this is also a place where a lot of just grassroots veterans groups have kind of stepped up, and basically they're thumbing their nose at the federal government. They're saying, yes, we are working with 5-MeO DMT and we know it's illegal. So what? Come and get us if you want. I mean, not necessarily in such an aggressive way, but they are saying, they are being a very above board, saying we are now serving veterans and we are building community and we are building networks of therapists and integration coaches and facilitators, and we are providing this, and we're doing it here in our homes. That we're not asking you to, you know, leave your job and go on vacation for a week or something like that. So I think that it is creating a lot more accessibility, and it's just part of that broader umbrella of the psychedelic renaissance, that things are changing culturally very quickly. And it's because regardless of where we stand scientifically on any of these things, that we know from the direct personal level and from the anecdotal level that people's lives, such as your own, are being transformed by these experiences, and that they are helping people, often people who are feeling desperate and people who feel that they don't really have any other good options. And one of the things that stands out to me is having spoken with a number of veterans who, kind of similar to what you described, that they've told me like, look, I was either going to take 5-MeO DMT or I was going to kill myself. Like that's literally
Exactly.
where I was at. So, of course we want everything to be safe. We want things to be, as helpful as possible. But the idea of, well, we've got to wait another 20 years for all the medical trials to go through before we're going to, give people permission to do this is like, no, there's not enough time. There's not enough time for a lot of people. That a lot of people feel that they're at the end of their rope. And so this does provide a viable lifeline for people. And that's where we see this, again, it's this grassroots arising of, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do it anyway, even though legally or scientifically or medically we don't have permission for this. And so I think that that's very brave.
It's so brave, but also so needed, the rebellion. And also, like, I've never met a single person ever who's tried a psychedelic in this fashion, doing large doses of psilocybin or even trying DMT that has left that experience and said, wow, this should be illegal. Like everyone that's trying it is championing the healing effects of it and how it's transformed their lives in just these crazy ways. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you, I know you mentioned earlier in this particular episode that you're not necessarily someone who believes in reincarnation or rebirth of the same soul coming back life after life. This did open for me curiosities about spirituality and what's really out there. And because I did experience the oneness during my 5-MeO DMT experience, it made me just question so much about, religion, not necessarily in the sense that we know it. In fact, very distinctly in my psilocybin journey, I was shown all these pillars of religion, like Buddhism and Catholicism and Christianity, and there's all these religions, and it was basically just smashing them together and just saying they're all essentially the same thing. And but I have so many questions and about spirituality now, and so I'd love, because you're so much more experienced. I'm 2 months into my journey here. You've been doing this for years. What is your take on all of this as a gateway or a doorway to spirituality? And what does this mean for you in a nutshell?
Yeah, well, I'm one of these sort of difficult to grasp paradoxical figures in the sense that I'm very comfortable talking about God. I'm very comfortable talking about the nature of being and the nature of reality. And then when people ask me like, well, okay, so what's your spiritual practice? And I tell them like, I don't have any. What are your spiritual beliefs? I don't have any. Most people don't ask me like, what's your religion? But if they were, it'd be like, well, none. And so here's my take on it. It's like this image of like all these pillars of the religion, they're all being smashed into one. Sometimes what people like to say that I think is kind of from a naive perspective is they say, well, all religions point back to the same truth and that they're all about fundamentally the same thing, and it's just kind of manifested through different cultures or different perspectives. What I like to say is I think it's actually giving religions too much credit, that religions ultimately, I view them all as products of the human ego. So it's the human ego that says, I'm here. Wait, who am I? Where am I? What's going on? Who's in charge? What's the point of all this? What do I need to do? And religion is a response to those questions posed by the ego. Mm. And all religions put out different goals and ambitions to, what does it mean to be a good Buddhist, a good Christian, good Hindu, good Muslim, good Jew, good Taoist, good Jain, good Sikh, we can just go on down the list.
Yeah.
And really what I see religions as doing is they helped human beings organize into large-scale societies where certain values, beliefs, ideas, and symbols became a form of communication and identity through which people could interact and say, okay, we see the world in somewhat the same way, so we can share these values. And human beings are social animals, so we do need various mediums through which we relate as social animals and relate to others. But again, that's a job that the ego fulfills, is how do I relate? Who am I? But when we go into the complete non-dual experience of absolute unity, what we find is, oh, I am the one universal consciousness, and it's what I've always been, and it's what I always will be. And regardless of what I do, think, or say, that's still the case. And therefore, and that this actually is where the present moment generates out of this unitary experience. And so it's actually here all the time. That means that the ambitions that are set out by religions, that those again, they apply to different social and psychological aspects of being human, but not about what is the ultimate purpose. So like if you live according to a religion where you want to go to heaven when you die, well, you have to assume that you have a soul, you have to have something that exists after death, and that there's got to be this place that you go to, or maybe there's a bad place called hell. But the non-dual experience, again, it reveals like, I'm not a soul. I am the universal being in consciousness that experiences itself as a human being. So for me, I was a self-identified spiritual seeker. And when I had my first 5-MeO DMT experience, I would say it cured me of being a spiritual seeker. It was like, oh no, this is it. And it's everywhere all the time. It's omnipresent. So therefore, whatever, and I kind of was like a philosophical Buddhist, and this idea of, well, you got to reach enlightenment so that you can stop reincarnation. It's like, oh, but that's not even a problem. Like, that's a fake issue. Like, reincarnation is not even a thing because there's only one universal being that is busy performing as every single incarnated being. And so God reincarnates, but individuals don't. Or if you're a Christian, you're like, well, I want to go to heaven after I die. And that God will rule over heaven. It's like, oh no, but I am that being. I'm and God. So that ambition, that also is not a legitimate ambition. Now, if we define spirituality as knowing yourself at a deep, intimate level and allowing yourself to express and embody authentically and to act from a place of open-heartedness and compassion and love, then I would say, yeah, I'm super spiritual. But for me, usually when people are asking about spirituality, they're asking about, well, do you pray? Do you meditate? Do you perform ceremonies? Do you read spiritual scriptures? Do you have spiritual ambitions? Are you like working on ascending or enlightening or whatever it may be? And I always say, look, the only job that God has is to be itself, and it's doing that whether we want it to or not. We as individuated expressions of this one universal being, that also is our only job, really, is be yourself. And if you find meaning in meditating or performing rituals, great, then do it. I personally don't. I find meaning in directing my energies mostly towards creative and expressive outlets. That's what I like to do. And that gives me a sense of meaning and purpose. And no, there's nothing cosmic about it. There's nothing transcendental about it. I like making art because it's fun. I like making music because it's satisfying and I enjoy it. And I like doing my podcast because I like it. I like helping people because I like it. And that, for me, these are all expressions of me being myself. So that's what I like to encourage with others, is that in order to be yourself, first you have to know yourself. And you meet yourself through the non-dual experience. That's the ultimate meetup with yourself. It's like, whoa, I'm it, and it's eternal and infinite, and that's me. Okay, and then I'm also this person who has this little teeny tiny lifespan, this little teeny tiny window to like do something with my life. And I have the possibility of doing that in a way that like nurtures my self-love and love and compassion for others. Or I could do it in a way that's really violent and disruptive. I could do that if I want. And it's not like God's back there saying, oh, you've been bad, or you've been good, or you're going to get rewarded, or you're going to get punished, or like, oh, this is going to make you be reincarnated another 100,000 times. It just doesn't work that way. So that whole motivation just completely dropped out for me. And so I'm looking at what can I do to really authentically be myself? And then through that, can I help others find within themselves the courage and the ability to authentically be themselves? And if I'm doing that, then I'm feeling satisfied.
I love that. What a great answer. And I'll make sure to hyperlink some of your stuff because you're so creative. I mean, you do music and art and all kinds of things. So very cool. And then I do have to ask, just because so many people experience aliens or visions in their experiences when they're going through psychedelics that don't appear to be human.
Yeah.
Do you believe in aliens?
I would like to believe in aliens. So here's my thing. I really am, like I said, I'm a radical non-dualist. Whenever I have visions in a psychedelic state, because they happen and I like them and they're interesting, they always, we come eye to eye, so it could be an alien or whatever, and I'll look at them and they'll say, yeah, I'm you. It's like, yeah, I know. So it's like I don't really get to play the game anymore in that sense, because I see through it all. And it sees through me that we know each other in that sense. And this is something that just energetically to me, as I was going through this whole process of getting to know myself and exploring the reality of myself, something that energetically came to me in a way that felt really, really profoundly true. And so that's just the best way I could describe it, was this realization, which again, can't prove it, was that, you know what? I think it actually takes an entire universe of different compositions of stars and planets to produce even one planet that has just the right, perfect mix of everything to evolve biological life. So I came out of this experience like, oh my God, I think maybe even though the universe is a super, super, super big place, like maybe Earth is the only place that this has actually happened. And maybe part of the grand evolutionary project is that maybe that's the goal, actually, is to get off the planet and to spread life around the galaxy and the universe, and that this is like the cosmic egg and seed for the rest of the universe. And that hit so hard that I wrote this novel. It's called The Solendarian Game, and it is about what was that evolutionary process that got us off the planet and out into the galaxy, and kind of explore that theme. That's my answer when people ask me, is like, I'd like to believe in aliens. I'd love to believe in like UFOs, and that'd be really, really cool. Like I'm totally into fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah.
I devour that kind of stuff. But my honest, energetic feeling is kind of this stark sense of, I think this is it. I think that we're actually alone, and therefore it puts all that much more pressure on us to like, don't fuck it up more than you already have. And it's time to move again from that phrase that I introduced earlier of being God toddlers to being God adults. And I know a lot of people would like to believe that there's all these complex alien societies out there, that they're watching over us, and that eventually they're going to come and they're going to fix all our shit for us. And it's like,
Fingers crossed.
yeah, I'm not holding out a lot of hope for that, because it's my honest, again, I can't prove it, so I'm not going to like stand on my hill with my flag and say like, I will not be removed. We are the only life in the universe. But that's just my feeling on it.
Yeah.
And, I'll go with it until I've actually meet an alien. I'm going to stick with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the things I love to do with my show is just explore people's opinions and their ideas and their concepts. There's a great big world out there, and there's so many different paths that people can go down. And so I just like to explore and just to ask these questions and find out what people think and believe. And especially after you've had such a deep experience with plant medicine, it just opens your eyes and a doorway to so much more. So, well, thank you so much for this conversation today. It's just been truly profound, and I'm so excited to continue it again in the future. Where can people find you?
Well, my main hub is just martinball.net. But as you mentioned, I am a rather multifaceted person, so I do have a lot of web presence in different areas. But through my main website that you can link to my podcast, which is The Entheogenic Evolution, it'll turn 17 years old in January of next year. And you can find that, wherever you get a podcast or on YouTube. And then my YouTube channel is also just The Entheogenic Evolution. For my integration work is non-dualentheogenicintegration.com. You can find my music anywhere that you find music online digitally, but just keep in mind there is another Martin Ball out there, and at some outlets put our music together. And this other Martin Ball, he made an album of Christian praise and gospel music.
Oh, don't get you too confused.
Yeah, and we have been entangled online ever since I first started releasing music online. So it's kind of been the bane of my existence musically. Like even today, you can go to Apple Music. And it took them like several years to separate his album out from my music. But still, if you go to Apple Music, if you go down to similar artists, they're all Christian praise artists. There's like nothing that actually matches my music in any way.
It's almost like you're cursed for saying that you're not necessarily religious. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's your karma right there.
No, God has a wicked sense of humor. That I always like to say that the more intelligent any being is, the more sophisticated its sense of humor, and the more it leans towards irony, because like irony is like the sweetest form of humor, because it's like, oh, that's so ironic. Because it would be ironic if irony weren't a thing. So it's ingrained into the universe. And then of course you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, but I do use the W. I should have used the W with music, so it's just Martin Ball as music, but as an author and on social media, I use my middle initial W because Martin Ball was already taken as a Gmail account, was already taken as a Facebook account, and there was already, as I first started putting out books.
Man, this other Martin Ball is really messing with you. He's just hitting you from all angles.
Well, there was another Martin Ball that was publishing books on Welsh phonetics. And now, apparently, there's another Martin Ball. There's even a Martin W. Ball in Australia.
No.
Who's got a website. And it's like, so, I guess there's different permutations out there. But I'm the one who makes the trippy music and art and, talks about psychedelic medicines. So
love that. And you're in Ashland, right? Ashland, Oregon? Mm-hmm. I went to Southern Oregon University for a hot minute. Back in 2009, 2010, somewhere in there. I was living in Southern Oregon for a little bit. And so very familiar with Ashland. Beautiful place to be. Yeah. Lovely, lovely place. And you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but you offer integration services for those that are going through integration, correct?
Yeah. And I do say that my integration comes from what I call a non-dual and energetic perspective. Which we've been discussing here, so that should give people somewhat of an idea. I do specialize in 5-MeO DMT, but I'm not limited to 5-MeO DMT in any way, shape, or form. But I'd say probably 80% of my clients are people who have had often experiences similar to what you've described, and they kind of come out of it like, what was that? Yeah. What was going on? And so a big part of it is just helping them to understand, like, this is the energetic process. So this is how it looks, this is what occurs, and here's how you work with it now at this point. And I just come from a very practical, grounded perspective. And I offer 30, 60, and 90-minute video calls. And almost all of my clients like to record the video so that then they can go and refer to it later. And
so smart.
Yeah. So that's what I do.
Well, thank you. I can't thank you enough. This has been so informative, for all of us people that are newbies to this space, just so we can get an idea of what this powerful medicine does, this powerful experiences and how they can integrate it into their lives. So really appreciate it. Can't wait to have you back again soon. Everybody, Martin Ball.
All right. Thank you.